To keep our episodes focused on our experts and the value that they bring to these conversations, we're supplementing them with some deep dives. These additional episodes may consist of conversations between Tim and Alyssa that deserve to be heard in full, or may highlight even more insight from our expert guests.
We're going to build on the groundwork Tim laid in Episode 4 and trace the roots of the LDS Church's extraordinary influence in the state of Utah. From the moment the Mormon pioneers arrived in the mid-1800s, the Church has made deliberate moves to control spiritual life and influence the political, legal, and economic systems in the region they settled. Understanding this systemic trajectory, from theological settlement to institutional stronghold, is key to understanding why demanding accountability, transparency, and reform from the LDS Church is so difficult to achieve both in Utah and globally.
Well, it acts like a major corporation. They shared their financial information with their members up until 1958, and then they closed the books on that. And it also coincided with a point where the church was in dire financial straits. It had been financially mismanaged, and they cleaned house and they brought in a whole new approach. They brought in members who came from the world of business, accounting, and they implemented the same kind of controls that major corporations do. So they became Mormon Inc., I would say, around 1958. And that's when the aggregation of wealth really began to take off. You know, I don't believe the church had a brokerage firm prior to 1958, but after that, they did. You know, they had investments and investment advisors, and they diversified, and they were very successful at growing their financial worth. And at the same time, they had a system where it was all revenue and very little expense because it was an all-volunteer church. Part of the reason the Catholic Church has always been financially bad straits is because it's expensive to operate something like the Catholic Church, you know, with all this legacy overhead, these cathedrals and churches, and, you know, just to keep the roof from leaking costs an immense amount of money. And on top of that, they have to maintain and support, you know, a massive worldwide professional clergy. Mormon Church doesn't have that kind of overhead, and they keep their physical infrastructure pretty modest, with the exception of temples. You know, word houses are not extravagant. They're pretty simple, straightforward. And also, I think with this, and they're intelligently promoting higher education to its members, along with education comes financial success, advancement. I mean, those are directly correlated. We know that. So you've got an organization that, despite its tremendous wealth and power, believes that it's in danger of persecution by the larger political majority in the country. They embarked on a deliberate campaign to encourage its members to get involved in politics at every level: dog catcher, school board, mayor, congressman, you name it. And so what you see today is Mormon Power is not just its money, but it's also its political influence, not just at all levels of government, but also in corporate America, in the legal system. And, you know, it has been very successful in doing that. And in doing so, it has insulated itself. So that's part of, I put that in the deliberate category.
Yeah, Marriott's JetBlue was founded by a Mormon. There's definitely some very high profile people who I don't even think, you know, I had a friend text me and ask me why there's a Book of Mormon in every Marriott hotel room. And it's because it's a Mormon family. But it's like Mormonism is in so many ways just this untold story of how a religious organization is part of a state. There's a kind of royal class of the rich and wealthy and the high ups. And I feel like sometimes when I talk to people, like reporters, about this, when I do interviews, I sound very like a conspiracy theorist, but it really is one of the richest churches on earth.
This is documented. I mean, based upon what is known, it is the richest church in the world per capita. But I think, and as a key point that I should have mentioned, that is obvious is that churches are tax exempt in the United States. Now imagine how much money you could aggregate if you didn't have to pay a penny in federal, state, local taxes. I mean, the compounding effect of tax-free wealth is astronomical. So that's how they could put together so much money, mostly revenue, very little expense or overhead. It's just it's all income, and you have, you bring in the CPAs, the accountants, and you bring in professionals in insurance, and they have an expertise that no other church has, or that they do, they have to pay for it, they go outside. This church keeps it inside, and because it is a worldwide church, centralized in Utah, this is the corporate headquarters, and it's much easier to manage something like that and to make it successful than if you are the Catholic Church, which in the United States alone, there's 202 separate diocesan corporations. Each one of them is a separate corporate entity, which is good in the sense that if you get sued, then, the limits of your liability are bound by, the geographical boundary of your corporation. Whereas the Mormon Church, it's both a benefit and a curse, is that if they ever did get tagged, it's one centralized organization and all that wealth would be exposed. What also is deliberate is that they have been proactive, at least in this regard, at using their money and power to influence legislatures through their lobbying efforts to not support or pass laws that are adverse to the interests of the church. Yes, they do have lobbyists who are compensated because nobody works for free. But my guess is that they don't hire outside lobbying firms because they don't need to, but they have dedicated lobbyists. Like everything the church does, it wants its people. It's not much different than I think any other lobbyist. You have an expense account. You can make donations to political campaigns. You maintain contact with certain legislatures. You keep an eye on every bill that gets filed and is moving through the process, and you monitor that. And because you get memos from the church that these are issues of concern to them. And so it's your responsibility to keep an eye out for anything. And if there's anything that you think might be of interest or concern to the church, if there's a bill wanting to restripe, a state highway, don't bother us with that. But, if it's anything that touches upon the church's teachings, most of the time you see the sparks fly around child sexual abuse, statute of limitations, efforts to keep states from passing statute of limitations. They get warned about that, and somebody, probably a general authority, and it's probably not much different than J.P. Morgan. It's professional. They know what their interests are, and they know how to protect them. So the church will join arms with other religious organizations, insurance companies, and so forth, who have a financial interest in not seeing survivors have access to justice. And they've got so much money that if they ever needed to go to anyone outside, they could do that. And they do. They go to non-LDS congressmen and make it known that they don't favor a particular bill that this congressman or senator is sponsoring, and they can kill it, and they do.
To ask a question I thought of just as you were speaking about Utah specifically, essentially what I'm wondering is, as Mormons were establishing their dominance in Utah, they wanted to set things up such that they could maintain as much autonomy as possible. Do you think that what happens with child sex abuse is something that they've staked out particularly to make it so that these are harder to defend against? Or do you think that this is part of a larger systemic issue where, because they don't want to cede any power, they don't want to set like a legal precedent for any case to be brought against the church. And so the reason that this exists for sex abuse specifically is because if they allowed the government to get a toe in, then the door could be opened further for other types of litigation against the church.
It's a good question. The church's power today is very much rooted in its history and the strengths and challenges of establishing itself once and for all in this wilderness. So that's the accident. It's allowed them to create, and they did create, a parallel legal system. They established a court system, land record system. There was a church system long before there was a secular system, and to a large extent, the system that exists today is the Mormon system. Everything from the widths of the street. Brigham Young wanted the mule train to be able to turn, so he wanted these wide boulevards. Land records were not kept by a county recorder, they were kept by a church official. Everything that you come to assume are the responsibilities of government, and in Utah, this was all an accident of history and the fact that this place was settled by adherents to the Mormon Church. That has given them control of the most important institutions, this state, the legislature, the court system, the political structure, such that you cannot go up against power in this state because you're going up against the Mormon Church. The Mormon Church will play by the generally accepted rules up to a point, except where they perceive that their interests are challenged. And so they will wade into political questions and political issues, sometimes ill-advised, as they did when they weigh in on gay marriage and some other issues and so forth. And so we don't have a lot of good news for individuals who were abused in Utah, who wish to pursue justice against the Mormon Church, not because what happened to them was untrue or that their claim is not meritorious. It's that the legal system has been closed to them in Utah, whether it by statute of limitations, by rulings from the Supreme Court and lower courts in Utah that cut off avenues to pursue accountability and justice against the Mormon Church. We have gone through those, and they have been, through their lawyers and their lobbyists in the state of Utah, 100% effective at closing every door. When I began bringing cases in Utah, there were a couple of doors that looked like they might be open. Well, those got closed. So I don't bring cases in the state of Utah. If the abuse occurred in another state, I could sue the Mormon Church in the state of Utah, but I don't, because the cards are stacked against us. So, this is something I've said as well, and it sounds hyperbolic, but it's true. I mean, Utah is, the state of Utah. No, it's not the state of Utah. When you analyze it, it is a theocracy dominated by the theocratic power of the LDS Church, yet it has all the rights and privileges of a state, and it desperately wanted that. And that was also part of the deal for abandoning official polygamy, was statehood. They desperately wanted statehood. They wanted to be brought in. And, they've got 2 senators and how many congressmen, but they've also been able to expand their, it's not even the state of Utah, it's the land of Zion. You could take a marker and mark big sections of Montana, Idaho, Eastern Washington, Oregon,
the Mormon Corridor,
Arizona. And that's really, that's the land of Mormon power. And it's raw political power. The church may not exercise it constantly, but it certainly has the ability to use it whenever it feels it needs it. If it needs to reach out and say, we think you need to reduce these charges, or we think, I've got so many war stories I can tell, but the power of the church to pick up the phone and call anybody, and not just here, but in really almost any place in the country, and lean on them, they know that the church has the ability to get its way, and it will. They can call up, In the day, they could call up Orrin Hatch, who was, chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, if they didn't like a particular judge that was being proposed. Or, they had, LDS, I don't know, what did they have? At one time, 5, 6, 7 LDS senators in the U.S. Senate, how many Congress people, and so forth. And of course, these people aren't doing the church's business every day, but they know they're there. Just like the church, I guarantee that if you actually dug in, and I've done it, and this is just from my experience, how is it that Provo law grads get some of these prime positions with Supreme Court justices? That's a credential to have clerked for Supreme Court justice.
I know stories of people leaving the church and then going back to it just for show, because the networking opportunities within the church are so vast that it's actually takes a hit to their net worth to leave the church.
Oh,
there's
absolutely.
So many opportunities.
This is another thing we haven't talked about is, you've lost your testimony. So what, honey? We can't afford not to be going to church. Okay. They know, either having observed the experiences of others who have left, you will lose your friends, your community, your family, your employer, your business contacts. You'll become a pariah. And maybe it's not as bad as it was, but it's basically, you're being cast out into the wilderness. I experienced this when I came, because I wasn't licensed in Utah, to try and find a law firm to partner with here. And, I talked to some very highly respected LDS litigators in Salt Lake and Provo. And, they'd say, Tim, I sympathize entirely. I'm with you on this, but I can't get involved in this case. If you came to me with, a case where a missionary, drove over and killed a little old lady in a crosswalk, that'd be one thing. But this, no way. I just can't do it. I made so many trips here just trying to find somebody that would work with me here. But I had dozens of clients who had viable cases, if only we had been in a place where justice was even conceivable, but it's not. Yeah. I remember one case we had here, and it was right here in Salt Lake County, and the judge, an African-American judge here in Salt Lake County, a Buddhist, because it's a random selection of judges. I thought, wow, we've got a chance here. And, it was, the church brought a motion to dismiss on the same frivolous grounds that they'd brought in Oregon and Washington State, and lost on that motion. And he said, Mr. Kosnoff, I understand your arguments, and I think they have a great deal of merit, but I'm going to rule against you. And I want you to know that I want you to appeal my decision. And if you can get the appellate court or the Utah Supreme Court to reverse me and send this case back, I promise you I will give you a fair trial. And he was sincere, but I understood the message.
The level of institutional reach Tim described can feel daunting, and it's true that Utah's justice system presents real structural barriers to accountability due to the influence of the LDS Church over Utah's courts. But it's important to keep in mind when discussing how power operates that we can also discuss how it can be challenged. In the episodes and deep dives ahead, we'll break down some of the legal landscape and offer guidance for survivors and advocates both within and without the state of Utah. And we'll spotlight people and movements working every day to make change for the better.